So if you were here last week, you understand or you remember that we started a small Christmas series called Christmas at the Movies. And I played a clip from a movie that was How the Grinch Stole Christmas. And this week, I chose a clip from a movie that goes all the way back to a story that's over 150 years old. It's a story known as from a movie called A Christmas Carol. And that story has rich traditions, and it goes all the way back, and it was written about in the mid-1800s. And so this morning, we're going to look at some themes and some ideas that specifically come from a movie known as A Christmas Carol. Hopefully it's a movie and a story that you're familiar with. So would you take a second and just watch this clip this morning?
Stone to which you point. Answer me one question. Are these the shadows of things that will be, or shadows of things that may be? Men's courses in life foreshadow certain ends. But if these courses are departed from, these ends will change, isn't that so? No! No! Am I that man who lay upon the bed? Spirit, hear me! I'm not the man I was! Why show me this if I've past all hope? Spirit! Spirit, assure me that I may change these shadows you've shown me. Change them by an altered life! No, Spirit! No! No, Spirit! Good Spirit! Help me! Spirit! Help me, Spirit! I will honor Christmas in my heart, and try to keep it on the air. I will not shut out the lessons of the past, nor present, nor future. Oh, pray, Spirit, tell me I may sponge away the writing on that stone. Stone to which you point. Answer me one question. Are these the shadows of things that will be, or shadows of things that may be? Men's courses in life foreshadow certain ends. But if these courses are departed from, these ends will change, isn't that so? No! No! Am I that man who lay upon the bed? Why show show me this if I'm past all hope. Spirit! Spirit, to show me that I may change these shadows you've shown me. Change them by an altered life. No, Spirit! No! No, Spirit! Good Spirit! Help me! Spirit! Help me, Spirit! Help, Spirit! Spirit, I will honor Christmas in my heart until you keep it on the air. I will not shut out the lessons of the past, nor present, nor future. Oh, pray, Spirit, tell me I may sponge away the writing on that stone.
So the movie A Christmas Carol is such a good movie, and that's the Disney production of it, but it has come out in many forms and in many fashions over the year. But in the movie A Christmas Carol, you get to walk through the life of a man named Ebenezer Scrooge, the man who's portrayed in this portion. And as you walk through his life, and he being the main character, you get to learn who he is. You get to learn about his attitude towards life. You get to learn about his work and what he does, and you get to learn a little bit about his family. And early on in the movie, A Christmas Carol, you learn about his former business partner, a man named Jacob Marley. And you learn how Jacob Marley died. And one of the first aspects of this movie that's so cool is that Scrooge is visited in his dream by Jacob Marley. And this interaction between Scrooge and his visitation from Jacob leaves Scrooge wondering what his life is going to be like, wondering if his life, if he doesn't change anything in his life, will it end up just like his former business partner? And so the movie goes on this journey with Scrooge of being visited by ghosts. And if you remember, the first ghost is the ghost of Christmas past. And then he's visited by the ghost of the present. And then finally, at the end of the movie, this scene that you just watched takes place. And what's unique is that it's not the ghost of Christmas past or the ghost of Christmas present, but it is the ghost of Christmas future. This scene right here that has the most impact on the life of Ebenezer Scrooge. And today, I want to talk about the real Christmas story, the biblical Christmas story. And you know what's so unique about the biblical Christmas story is that there's so many characters. There are these guys known as the three wise men. There's a character in the real biblical Christmas story of Caesar Augustus, who holds a census, who gives reason for why the characters have to travel back to their hometown of Bethlehem. There is a king in the real biblical Christmas story who is looking to kill all of the male babies. There are shepherds in this Christmas story who follow a star up in the sky There is a mother in the Christmas story who is Mary, who has been pregnated supernaturally. There's an aunt whose name is Elizabeth, who is further along also with child, who now is going to have the cousin of the little baby Jesus. And then obviously the Christmas story is about the central character who is the baby Jesus himself. And then also there is the character of the innkeeper who has to deliver the bad news that there is no vacancy and there is no room to have the child. Those are all of the characters, but I left one specific character out because there is one character in the biblical Christmas story that always catches my eye, that seems to always tug at my heart personally, because being a man and being somewhat around his age, I begin to think about and relate some of his struggles. And so the character that I wanted to specifically talk to you about and just talk with you about today is the character of Joseph, because his character is so unique. And today I specifically want to look at his interaction with the angel that the Lord sends to him. And so to do that today, we're going to look at Matthew chapter 1, starting in verse 18. So if you have a Bible with you this morning, would you turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 1? And if you don't, maybe you have the Bible on your phone, or there's a Bible around a pew near you. And today, this morning, specifically looking at the life and this interaction with Joseph, I want you to see that just like in the life of Scrooge, of Ebenezer Scrooge, it was his interaction with the ghost of the Christmas future that made such a big difference. It made a life-changing difference in the life of Scrooge. Today, this interaction with the angel of the Lord that tells him about something in the future is going to change Joseph's life. This is the main interaction. This is the life-changing moment in the life of Joseph that we have referred to many times throughout Scripture. And if all of your life came down to just one interaction, I wonder what that would look like. But specifically today, this is the portion of all of Joseph's life that we get the most details about. This is one of the, if not the most important aspect that happens in the life of Joseph. And so today, would you look as I read, starting in Matthew chapter 1, verses 18, and I will read just a few verses. This is how the birth of Jesus came about. His mother, Mary, who was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be with child through the Holy Spirit. Because Joseph, her husband, was a righteous man and did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her and to do it quietly. But after he had considered this. Now, before we go any further, I want to maybe share or add some detail concerning the great predicament that Joseph is in. You see, we read this story all the time. We read these 2 or 3 verses all of the time, and we think that we know and we have all this understanding of about Joseph and the predicament that he's in. But I just want to offer a little bit more, a little bit deeper of some details of the predicament, the crazy problem that Joseph is in right here. First and foremost, I want to highlight for you that the text makes it very clear, saying that Joseph was a righteous man. Now, normally we talk about righteousness in the Bible as being right with God, but that's not what he's talking about here when it says that Joseph was a righteous man. When it describes Joseph and the detail that it gives us, one of the only details that it gives us is this idea of righteousness. What I want you to understand is that Joseph did everything in his life to live within the bounds and the means of the local law and what the local culture would say is right to do. You see, what this means is that Joseph did everything that he could to be right within the law, the local law, and within the local culture. This is what you and I would esteem to do, to live right by the land, to live right in the eyes of our peers, to live right in the eyes of those that we go to church with. You see, Joseph made it a priority of his life to make sure that he was right when it came to being within the law and the local culture. And it says here that he, Joseph, and Mary were in what was known as the second stage of being married. And I want to describe for you what the 3 stages of the marriage process would look like culturally for them. You see, the first one would be that their parents over time would have grown in relationship with one another. This is similar to an arranged marriage because their parents and their families would have over time spent time together and have decided that their 2 children were going to get married. This may sound so culturally different than what you and I do or the culture that you and I live in, and it was very different. It wasn't wrong in their culture for their parents over time to decide that both Joseph and Mary would get married. And they would have hopefully engaged their children in this decision. It wouldn't have been a decision that would have been made against the wishes of the children, but it was ultimately a decision that parents would choose. And so over time, these parents, they would gather together and they would make sure that their children, this was something that they really wanted and that their children would be okay with, but it was a decision that they would make. And so once they decide as parents that their children were going to be married to one another, then step or stage 2 would happen. An engagement or a betrothal period would happen, and this is exactly what has happened in their life, in the life of Joseph and in the life of Mary. And the initial portion of this stage was that as parents, they would financially exchange, in terms of a contract, what they deemed was necessary to be married. Now, there wasn't a specific exchange that would happen that every child would be exchanged for this amount of money. It was all dependent upon the families, and it was all dependent upon the circumstances of that situation. But what this would mean is that the groom's parents, so Joseph's mother and father, they would see that they would want Joseph and Mary to get married, and so they would work with Mary's parents, and they would talk about what it would take financially for their families to be intertwined. Maybe it was a piece of land. Maybe it was a certain amount of animals. Maybe it was a particular animal that they would exchange in order that this marriage could happen. And that would be the beginning of this second stage. Now, what's so unique about this engagement stage is that the engagement would take place when the families would ultimately have exchanged whatever those resources, whatever those monetary or physical things that they would exchange that would have tied their families together. This would also help us understand as to the importance of this stage. You see, it's when the families purchase this marriage agreement or this contract that would have happened that kicks off this second stage of being engaged. This is when this happens, this becomes the legal time that they would have been married. You see, for us, when we enter into, in our culture, this engagement time, as engaged couples, you are allowed legally to separate without any recourse. This is a time to make sure that you want to be married before the wedding day, because if not, if you break that relationship in our culture as an engaged couple, there is no recourse other than just the emotional recourse that's paid. But in their culture, when the parents would choose to intertwine based upon the selling and the exchanging of resources, when that would happen, then they, at that point, were married. And this engagement process, this betrothal process, was something that would last for at least a year and sometimes a little longer than a year. And so Joseph, right now, in this text, it says that he is engaged. He is engaged to be married to Mary herself. And her family and Joseph's family, they have intertwined themselves. They have exchanged all of the monetary resources. They have done what they needed to do. And I want you to understand something, because the text makes it very clear to us some things in other places about who Mary was. And we know that specifically she was favored by God, but we also know that she was a woman that was highly favored in a lot of other arenas. And so people and men and women and other families in that culture, they would have been thinking very highly of Mary. And all that to say, I want you to understand that the price that Joseph's parents paid in order that he and Mary could be married together was more than likely a very high price. It was a very expensive set of circumstances that Joseph's family would have paid in order that they could be married. And right now, Joseph is in a predicament that is extremely serious. Because I want you to think about what his options are. Joseph is legally married in this engagement process. And so the only way to break off this marriage is to go through a divorce. And as the male trying to think about going through divorce, since they are legally married, there's only one specific circumstance that would allow this to happen. And it would be some proven type of adultery. Now, when it comes to adultery in their days, there was only one real way to understand that adultery had happened. Because if adultery is only second or third hand knowledge, oh, I heard about him or her sleeping with or doing things that they shouldn't have done, then all of that's only second, third, or fourth hand knowledge. But the only first way, the only concrete way to know that adultery had taken place was by the effects of pregnancy. It's something you can't hide. It's something you can't speak anything. You can't lie about. You can't say anything against it. When it happens, it has physical effects. So Joseph, right now, is in the middle of a predicament that he doesn't know what to do, because divorce is the only option he can figure out, and there are only two ways for him to get a divorce. The first one is publicly. For him to divorce her publicly would mean that he would bring her to a group of people known as the elders, and he would make very public that there has been adultery that has occurred within their marriage, and that he would be divorcing her. And if he did that publicly, then the only recourse, the only thing that would happen was that Mary, carrying the baby Jesus, that she would be publicly stoned. And when it says that she would be stoned, it would mean that she would be stoned to death. That's one option. And it says right here in verse 19 and 20 that Joseph loved Mary so much that he was going to go through divorce, but he didn't want to do it that way. He wanted to do it a better way. And so he was thinking, if I go through divorce, if I don't do it publicly, then maybe I could divorce her privately. Maybe I could figure out how to divorce her in a way where she wouldn't have to experience stoning and the stoning unto death. And so Joseph right now is in the middle of probably the biggest problem, the biggest predicament of his entire life. And he doesn't know what to do. All he can think of doing is to get a divorce, because that's what a righteous man who wanted to be righteous in the law and also righteous amongst everybody else in the culture, that's his only option. And these are the only two ways that he can think of getting a divorce. And this morning, guys, my question for you, now that you may have a little bit more details into the life of Joseph, is in the midst of your life, when things are difficult, when the weight of this world feels so heavy, when you're looking at your life and you're in a situation and all you can think about is option 1, option 2, choice A and choice B, and neither one of those options looks like a successful option. In our world, we call this a lose-lose situation. So then you're trying to figure out how to answer or solve a problem where you're just trying to figure out the best of the two worst options. Which one is going to cause me to lose the least? You guys have been in situations like this in the past, and I imagine sometime in the future, maybe the near future or in the further away, sometime in your life you're going to be in a situation like this, where all you have are two options, or all that you think you have are two options, and neither one of them are good. And all you can think is which one is the least of the worst of the two options. Similar to Joseph in his life. My question is, what are you going to do? Because Joseph is in the midst of this situation right now, and in verse 20, at the very beginning of 20, it says that he had considered this. This means that in his mind, he is doing anything and everything possible to exhaust everything that he can think of. He is up late at night. He is thinking about any ideas, any opinions, any options, and there's just nothing he can think to do other than these two avenues. But I want to share with you the rest of the story, because the rest of the story is that God steps into the situation. And when God steps into the situation, often He provides a third avenue. When all you think is it's either option A or option B, and neither one of them look good, I want to share with you the rest of the story and how God steps into the situation and offers a different avenue, a different pathway that Joseph had not thought about up to this point. So listen as I read further along in the story, starting in verse 20 again. But after he had considered this, then an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in his dream, and he said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived inside of her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. And all of this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. So this portion of the text, it tells us that Joseph, you will not divorce Mary publicly so that she'll be stoned to death. You're not going to do that. You're also not going to do option B that says that you will divorce her privately so that she can live a life unashamed. You see, the angel says you're not going to do this, you're not going to do that, but instead you will get married. You will continue along in this marriage process. You will be her husband. You will be the father to this child which you did not create biologically, and you will call him Jesus. You will call him the one that God brings salvation through. I want you to understand that when the angel offers this third pathway, this option 3, option C, when he does this, I want you to think about this as how crazy this option is. This is nothing logical. None of this makes sense because what the angel says to Joseph is absolutely crazy. The first reason why it's crazy is because first and foremost that Joseph is being told what to do by an angel. Now don't forget that Joseph has a desire to want to be righteous. This means that he wants to do everything that's right by the law. And to do things right by the law and right by the culture means that he has to be able to publicly defend himself. And when it comes to this option, there is nothing publicly defendable about it, because it is an interaction that Joseph has with an angel of the Lord. Nobody else is there. Nobody else can defend him. Nobody else can help people understand what the angel said. This is just an interaction between Joseph and an angel that the Lord sends. Absolutely crazy. This is also crazy because he prides himself on being righteous. In particular, what are Joseph's parents going to think? You see, Joseph's parents have given and sacrificed and laid before him an amount of money and resources. They've set all that aside so that they could get married. And now Joseph is trying to do right so to make sure that his parents still are esteemed, so that they're not made fun of in the culture and by the law. And now he's being told to choose an option C that is absolutely crazy, because his parents are now going to feel the effects of this decision. The craziness of this decision is one that has effects not only in the life of Joseph, but it also drastically affects Mary and this baby and their two families. And also, I want you to think about how crazy it is that Joseph is supposed to believe that God is finally speaking. You see, Joseph knew all about the prophets. He had read all of Isaiah chapter 9 that talks about this child that's going to come one day and be born of a virgin. Joseph knew about all of this. But Joseph also knew in the back of his mind that God, up to this point, had been silent. That God had not chosen to break through this silence for almost 400 years. And this is so difficult because now all of a sudden God is choosing to break this silence and to speak into the life of Joseph in a way that's absolutely absurd. And Joseph is supposed to believe in a God who has been absolutely silent. And God is saying, listen, I know that this sounds crazy. I know that you think you only have two options, but I'm telling you there's a third option. And I want you to do this. I want you to marry her. And I want you to be a father to this child. And I want you to love this child even though biologically you didn't help make this child. I want you to do in your life what sounds crazy. And you will be blessed. And even though you haven't heard from me, God says, in over 400 years, your faith is going to be tested. This is going to be hard, but this is what I'm calling you to do. And this is why the life and the story of Joseph is so amazing. Because I want you to listen now how the story ends. Now that you've put yourself in his situation and you've seen the predicament that he's in, where you thought that you would have had no other options, and if God were to give you an option that sounds absolutely ludicrous, that would seem completely crazy, that would seem outside the norms of the law of that day, of the culture of that day, think about how you would have responded if you were honest today. And listen to verse 24 and 25 and to hear how the story ends. Because it says that when Joseph woke up, this means that he didn't let days go by, he didn't let weeks go by, he didn't let months or years go by, but immediately God spoke to Joseph through an angel that he sent to him, and immediately when Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him, and he took Mary home to be his wife. And he had no union with her until she gave birth to a son, and Joseph gave his son the name Jesus. So this morning, what's unique is that the predicament that they're in is the craziest predicament I could ever think about for a man's life. And when he had only what he thought were two options, God steps in and gives a third option. An option that's absolute ludicrous. An option that's completely crazy. An option that nobody else in the world would have ever thought of. And God says, I want you to live a life of faith. And I want you to do something that you could have never imagined. And the story ends with Joseph obeying in faith and doing what God said, exactly how the angel of the Lord told him to do it. And we get to be beneficiaries of the rest of the story because we get to see that even in the midst of all of this craziness, even in the midst of all of the culture and the law not lining up with the decision that Joseph chose to make, we get to see that the life of Joseph was one that was blessed. And so this morning, unlike Scrooge, you may never get to meet a spirit of Christmas future. And unfortunately, unlike Joseph, you may never have an interaction from an angel of the Lord in your dreams. But I promise you, without a shadow of a doubt, that you will find yourself sometime in an impossible situation where you think that you only have two options, option one and option two. But if you will let yourself, and if you will seek the wisdom and the counsel of the Lord, and you will seek out your difficult options to the Lord and see what He has to say, most of the time He will step in with a third option. And the third option that the Lord may bring to you, the third doorway and pathway and avenue that He may open for you, it very well may seem crazy. It very well may seem like nothing that fits in this world. But my question is, today, will you do what's easy? Will you and I only do what feels comfortable, what may keep us righteous in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of our fellow peers? Or today, will you do what sounds crazy? Will you do what would be faithful to the Lord?